Record to the cloud. Here we go. Now time for screen sharing. It's always an adventure on Zoom. Hopefully you can see that. All right, so Mr. Dasgupta is a program officer at the Dana Foundation, specifically responsible for overseeing the NextGen program. The goal of the NextGen program specifically is to strengthen neuroscience's positive role in the world by creating a new generation of interdisciplinary experts who shepherd neuroscience and neurotechnology users for a better world. So hopefully many of us in the call will be involved in those efforts in the future. Previously, Mr. Dasgupta was a Dana Foundation Fellow in Neuroscience Society. And before joining Dana, he was a postdoc scholar in the Department of Philosophy and the Center of Neurotechnology at the University of Washington. Shout out to the West Coast folks. A lawyer by training, his postdoctoral research examined ethical issues related to emerging neurotechnologies by utilizing qualitative methodology and policy analysis. Past research topics, it's a very long, very interesting list. It includes patient attitudes towards induced pluripotent stem cells, inclusion of pregnant women in biomedical research, and the use of tissue samples in genetics research. At the University of Washington, focused on research around the development and use of implantable neural devices, some of which Dr. Farah also touched on very briefly, like deep brain stimulation, brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs for short. And as for his education, he received his JD from the University of Maryland and an M.P.H from Johns Hopkins. So I believe, Mr. Dasgupta, you're actually one of our first lawyers who is in the neuroscience area. So Cool. This is a super interesting perspective, I'm sure. And I will pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me come today to speak. And this is, I really love the organization that you've been able to put together. And you guys were fortunate enough to hear from Dr. Farah, who is actually, I would say, one of the pioneers in the field of neuroethics. So today, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the ethics of neurotechnology. Does that, can everyone see my screen well? Okay, cool. And it's going to be a little bit of a sort of a mixture of different topics. But, when I was thinking about what to sort of talk about, I thought it would be useful to give you sort of a broad overview of where neuroethics even comes from. A lot of the times we think about neuroethics issues, but we don't really know the historical connection. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of bioethics, maybe the big sister to neuroethics, and how the field of neuroethics is really developed. And in the second part of my talk, I'll talk a little bit about the work that I did at the University of Washington and talk about some of the issues around neurotechnology, both in clinical neurotechnologies as well as consumer neurotechnologies. And then I'll quickly end with sort of a quick sort of discussion of different ways to sort of build careers in this space, whether it's neuroethics or neuroscience society. And I'd love to, spend the bulk of the Q&A answering any questions that you might have in terms of how to get involved, different ways to sort of strategize if this is something that you're really passionate about, and any other questions you might have. So I'll start off with something that's sort of a classic philosophical problem, and you've probably seen memes, internet memes about the trolley problem in different ways, but let's start off by just talking about the sort of the classic trolley problem. So if you haven't heard of it before, what happens in the trolley problem is you suddenly find yourself next to these train tracks, and you see that some evil person has tied 5 people on one train track, and it seems like this rushing trolley is going to run over these people and kill them. So you're stuck with a choice here. You could either pull this lever and redirect this trolley so it goes in the track with just one person. Of course, it would kill that one person. Or you could do nothing and simply allow the trolley to move forward and kill the 5 people. So why do I bring up this example? It's because this is a classic example in what's called applied ethics. And ethics can be defined in a lot of ways, but when it comes to topics like bioethics or neuroethics, ethics is really a particular way of looking at a scenario and deciding on balance what the best decision may be. And you might see that there's no right answers here, right? Either option seems kind of messy, right? Either way, someone's going to die. But that's sort of encapsulates what ethics is all about. Sometimes there aren't a good, there isn't a right answer. There might not even be a good answer. But what ethics is really important and useful is trying to think through what might be the best option in a tricky situation. So just to get an idea of what you would do, in the chat, put A if you'd pull the lever resulting in the death of one person, or B, if you would do nothing, resulting in the death of 5 people. So what do people think? What would you do? Seeing some results come in. So we got some A's, got a B, seeing mostly A's here. Actually surprising. Sometimes, most of the times you hear polls about this, the answers are a little bit more divided, but it seems like this group, we're all sort of going with A, let's pull the lever. Let's, you know, even if it results in the death of one person, let's try to save the 5 people, right? And depending on where you are on this answer, you might align with 2 really important moral theories that are used in all sorts of applied ethics. The first one is based on a man named Immanuel Kant, and it's called Deontological theories of moral theories. And basically, if you were a Kantian, you would probably say B, because you'd say, look, it's wrong to kill a person. It doesn't matter what the situation is. Deontological moral theories say there are certain principles that you have to respect. And one of those principles might be, let's never kill anyone, regardless of the situation. Or let's not kill someone, even if it means saving other lives. And so if you said B, you might be more of a Kantian. If you said A, you might actually agree with this man named John Stuart Mill, who is sort of the founder of this moral theory called consequentialism. And consequentialists in general, I mean, obviously there's a lot of detail, but on a very basic level, they want to maximize the most good. So a consequentialist would say, hey, look, it doesn't matter if we're killing someone. As long as we're saving 5 people, there's a net positive, right? So we're +4 in terms of lives saved. So that's what we should do. But again, like I mentioned at the beginning, there's really no right answer here, because either way, you lead to sort of a negative result. So ethics is important, not really even about necessarily getting the right answer or the right option, but really helping you think through why is the reason you chose an answer, right? We might intuitively think A or B, but really where ethics is really important is it helps you think, what are the reasons why I chose something? So of course, I don't want to say that those are the only 2 moral theories. There are more than that. And I'll quickly touch on a couple other ways that people think about ethics. There's the ethics of care, which sort of emphasizes relationships. So if you are, say, a parent and you have a child, ethics of care might come in, right? Because you have a duty to care for your child. Similarly, doctors might have a duty to care for their patients. There's also something called virtue ethics, which comes from ancient Greek philosophy. And the Greek philosophers said that there are certain ways or certain concepts that we should, or certain virtues that we should live our life by. So for example, happiness, fulfillment, success, and satisfaction were only available to people if they lived by certain virtues. So that might be one way to look at it. You might say, hey, we should be brave people, or we should be respectful people. There's also rights theory, which is again based on Kant's theories, but it says that all humans are born with certain fundamental rights and those should be respected. And there's also casuistry, which is basically called case-based analysis. So in any situation, if you're deciding, hey, should I pull the lever or not, you might think back, what have people done in the past? And if in the past people have traditionally have been okay with pulling the lever, maybe you say that's what we should do because it's based on historical precedent. If you think about law, something like the Supreme Court, casuistry is sort of, that's where it comes from, right? Sometimes you have precedent that you respect. So the point is here that all of these different moral theories have existed for hundreds and maybe thousands of years. There's a question of why did bioethics suddenly become a field in the 1900s? And I'd say there's 2 historical things that happened that really made this into a field. The first are the Nuremberg Trials. So you might have heard about these trials, but they are actually one of the first times that bioethics principles were codified in some written way. And so this is coming out of World War II, where the Nazis did lots of horrible experiments on prisoners, oftentimes exposing them to extreme cold, starving them, putting them in extreme situations, and all without the consent of the research subjects, if we can even call them that, right? And so after this happened at the Nuremberg trials, many Nazi leaders were held on trial for criminal charges, saying, look, you can't, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you learn something valuable or scientific from this. You cannot ask people to be participating in research without their consent. And that was one of the big things that came out of the Nuremberg trials, is the idea that you have to ask for consent. Another big sort of experiment or science sort of debacle that led to bioethics coming around is the Tuskegee experiments. And if you're unfamiliar with what happened at Tuskegee, is that the United States Public Health Service actually conducted research on Black men in the South who had syphilis. And you might say, okay, on some level, sure, we should, it seems fine to do research on a disease like syphilis. That's horrible. We should try to find a cure. But what we found out is that the US Public Health Service actually had a cure for syphilis, and they withheld that from the research subjects. So after this came to light, many in the United States and worldwide said, we really need some sort of regulations to make sure that people are being ethical when they do research. So that was another big sort of historical moment. And so what came out of these sort of atrocities was this famous report called the Belmont Report. And what the Belmont Report said was that, all people, regardless of if you're a Kantian or, you believe in consequentialism, we all sort of share some common morality and common sense principles, right? Like all of us as decent human beings agree on most things. And so because there's more agreement than disagreement, maybe there's a way to come together and find a certain principles that we can all agree on. And the Belmont Report was heavily influenced by this book called The Principle of Biomedical Ethics by Tom Beecham and Childress. And they listed 4 principles that should be sort of respected regardless of the type of research or the type of ethics, bioethics you're doing. And I'll quickly just touch on these just to illustrate, right? These are sort of, if you're doing a classic bioethics analysis, these were the sort of principles you would use. They're called respect for persons, right? So, and that's a norm respecting the decision-making capacities of autonomous people. So when you think about something like informed consent, right? You ask for someone's permission before they enter a research trial. That's what respect for persons is, right? You're respecting their ability to decide whether or not they want to take on the risk of participation. There's non-maleficence, which can often be sort of, summarized by something called, you might have heard the Hippocratic Oath, right? All doctors take the Hippocratic Oath. And it basically means do no harm, right? That's part of it, right? So if you have a patient or a research participant, it means at the very least, don't make them worse off, right? Don't do something that will hurt them or make them worse off. There's beneficence, which is sort of the opposite of non-maleficence. It means, when you can benefit the patient or the research subject, try to do that. Or at least if you can't directly benefit them, try to balance the benefits and risks. And lastly, justice. And justice can be thought about in a lot of ways, but basically one way to think about it is, are the products of a research study distributed fairly to everyone? Are the people who are participating in a research study, are they taking on too much risk compared to sort of the benefits they're going to get? So we did a sort of crash course on bioethics here, but you might ask, right? So what's neuroethics? Why this new field? Is it really required? Is it different? It sort of just sounds like it's bioethics, but it has this neuroscience focus. So let's talk a little bit about what neuroethics is. And so I mentioned, right? So respect for persons is this classic bioethics principle. And, so you might think, okay, if someone is starting a clinical trial for a deep brain stimulation device or a responsive neurostimulation device, we established, right? You have to ask for their permission, right? So you have to ask, hey, do you want to be part of this clinical trial? If they say yes, if they, have gotten all the information about the risks and benefits and they say yes, we said, okay, we've met our obligation under respect for persons. We've respected their autonomy, right? Seems to be fine, no problem there. But when it comes to talking about sort of, say, brain stimulators, it's hard sometimes to know which person you're talking about. So there are lots of reports, for example, if you get a deep brain stimulator and it's turned on, suddenly this person who was a certain way behaves completely differently. So there's this classic example for deep brain stimulators for Parkinson's, where there was a patient who had Parkinson's. When their deep brain stimulator was turned on, they became extremely manic. They started gambling or going out and shopping in large amounts. And it was almost like they were a different person. So a neuroethics question might ask, right? Who is the person we're respecting? Is it the person before they got the DBS? Or is it the person after they got the DBS, right? And using a classic bioethics analysis leaves us stuck, right? Which person do we respect? Another way that neuroethics could be different and can't just use bioethics principles is looking at beneficence. Dr. Farah talked a little bit about enhancement technologies, right? So we have this idea that, we should try, if possible, to make people better off. But where does better stop, right? Does better mean getting someone who might have a condition back to normal? Or does better mean taking them from what's sort of species typical to something well beyond what our species can do? And that's a question that you really can't answer using bioethics, right? Because beneficence just says, in general, we should try to improve people's health if possible. But there's this neuroethics question of, but how far? Is a certain level too far? If say we start, living in this cyborg future, right? Does that mean that we're still actually human? So it illustrates, right, that there's certain types of questions in neuroethics that are a little bit different than bioethics, right? So we might ask, how is neuroethics different than bioethics? And an early paper by Dina Roskies at Dartmouth sort of laid out two different ways, right? So what she said was that part of bioethics and neuroethics are the same. So one way of looking at neuroethics is it's the ethics of doing neuroscience, right? So it's the ethics of practice, right? Or the ethical issues and considerations that should be raised in the course of designing and executing neuroscientific studies. So if you're doing a neuroscience study, right, it's really just sort of the bioethics of doing a neuroscience study. So it could be things like optimal clinical trial design, guidelines for tissue use, for brain organoids, privacy rights, informed consent, which we talked a lot about, or things like what's owed to a participant after they participate in a study. But what's really different about neuroethics is the second part, the neuroscience of ethics. And what that means is that the ethical implications of neuroscience, or the evaluation of the ethical social impact the results from those studies might have or ought to have on existing social, ethical, and legal structures. So this is getting a little bit into what Dr. Farah was talking about. As we learn more about the brain, how does that change the way we think about society? So it might have things like the implications of our mechanistic understanding of brain function for society. It might deal with questions of how does our knowledge of the brain change our views of criminality? How do we deal with lie detection technology and privacy if we can actually look into someone's brain and see what they're thinking? It deals with questions of how does changing your brain change who you actually are as a person? Or, for example, if you're not actually conscious or you don't have free will, are you actually responsible for your actions? So you can see sort of how neuroethics has slightly different questions than sort of a classic research ethics or bioethics framing. Now, some people have argued maybe we can actually have neuroethics principles in the same way that we have bioethics principles. And they said, maybe it's just different principles, right? So maybe we could have principles like inclusivity and modesty, relationality, right? Or care for subjects. And these will be slightly different than bioethics principles. But frankly, in my opinion, I don't think that's enough. And I'll tell you a little bit about why. So as we've seen in the last decade, funding for brain research has blown up, right? And part of this is not only sort of clinical research for brain research, like things like the NIH, but also sort of consumer neurotechnology. People like Elon Musk, as well as other startups that have, that are planning lots of different types of neurotechnology. And really, the principal approach just won't work because there's so many different types of neurotechnologies that each situation is going to be different. So as future neuroscientists, it's less important to learn certain principles and more important to try to understand in any situation, how can I approach a difficult topic and how can I get to an answer, right? It's less about a checklist and more about a way of thinking. So I wanted to touch a little bit about some of the work I did at the University of Washington, where we talked to end users of neurotechnology to try to better understand, right, what is their experience? So one question we looked at is, for example, should we remove a neurotechnological device if an end user experiences a change in personality? So I mentioned this classic example where Parkinson's patients would have change in personality. So a lot of the work we did at the University of Washington was try to figure out when is it possible to say that the person is different, and do concepts like authenticity matter? Another question we asked, right, is if someone is using a BCI or a brain-computer interface, and say they have a robotic arm and they accidentally punch someone in the face, right? They didn't mean to, but it reacted that way. In that situation, who's responsible for that action? Is it the actual end user? Is it the software developer? Or is it the manufacturer? So these are questions that I think are coming to the fore when before we never had that issue, right? Because you were moving your arm. We never had this other sort of layer of a machine that now, introduces this new area of responsibility. Another issue we looked at are what are some guidelines or, for storing, sharing, or securing recorded brain data, right? Implantable devices especially collect a tremendous amount of information from your brain. So how do we respect someone's privacy? Lastly, we also looked at the issue of sort of deep brain simulators that incorporate machine learning or AI algorithms to make decisions. And we looked at this question of how is implementation of AI into these neural devices changing the relationship between the user and the machine? So for example, traditionally deep brain stimulators either just turned on or off, but these next generation of deep brain stimulators have a machine algorithm that actually calculates the proper diagnosis without a clinician ever touching it. So there's this question of, who's in control? Is it the machine or the person? So these are just some of the issues that we touched on at the University of Washington. Of course, there are many others, but these are a lot of the emerging issues in this space. So I want to touch quickly about sort of our approach at University of Washington. And I think this is an approach that, while not perfect, is something that can be important for a lot of neuroscientists. And traditionally, ethics is sort of done at certain stages in the process of developing a neurotechnology. Maybe when you apply for funding, maybe when you are trying to get FDA approval, or for an IRB, for example, if you're trying to do a clinical research trial. But at the University of Washington, we really believed that ethics should be part of every process, every single step of science, right? Because it actually leads to more responsible technologies, as well as maybe better technologies, because you're actually taking end user input and bringing it into the actual science. So we have an NIH grant. We had an NIH grant looking at issues of agency, which I touched on. So I'm not going to talk a little bit too much about that. But one thing that I would encourage everyone to do, regardless if you're a neuroscience major or not, is try to find a course in ethics or bioethics, even at the undergraduate level. Most universities now have at least an ethics course, and we did at the University of Washington. But it will allow you to sort of get at least some of the basic concepts. So even if you're, training to be a neuroscientist, it's in the back of your mind. These issues are sort of back in the back of your mind. Another interesting model that we use at the University of Washington is called embedded ethicists. So what we actually had is, this is my colleague, Tim Brown, who's now an assistant professor, but when he was a graduate student, he actually, and he's a philosopher by training, he actually spent time in the UW Center for Computer Sciences Robotics Lab, and spend time with a desk right next to a computer scientist. And they worked together for over a year. And the idea there is that both disciplines can learn from each other, right? Tim would ask questions that maybe the neuroscientist or neuroengineer wouldn't think about. And conversely, Tim would learn things about the science that would be helpful in terms of ethical analysis. One problem we often see is that ethicists don't really know how the technologies work, and scientists don't really necessarily think about the societal implications right off the bat. But with having both sort of in the same room, you're able to sort of get that synergy. And we've found that actually leads to great results for both people. The last thing I'll touch on, and I think it's something that all neuroscientists and neuroengineers should really take seriously, is end user perspectives. At the end of the day, we have to realize that regardless of what we're trying to do, the technologies we put out into the world impact real people. At the end of the day, it is a person who is going to be the person who receives any sort of technology or any sort of science that you're working on, right? And it's vitally important that we listen to their needs. We listen to what they feel is important. Having spent 3 years talking to end users, often I hear that I don't even want this device, or scientists never asked me, for example, what I need, right? And a lot of the stories I hear is that people don't really need fancy gadgets. Someone who, for example, might have paralysis doesn't really want necessarily a BCI robotic arm. What they actually might want is something a little bit more functional, something that allows them to better use their iPad, something that allows them to get around their house a little bit easier. And that sometimes a focus on these sort of futuristic, cool devices is not actually meeting the needs of the people on the ground. So I would encourage everyone, when you have an opportunity to listen to end users or listen to people actually using these technologies, to take that opportunity and try to get their perspective. So I'm going to switch quickly to some careers in neuroethics, and then I would love to just open it up for questions. And I'm happy to sort of answer questions either about the ethics of neurotechnology or about sort of ways to approach a career in neuroethics. But I'll start off sort of a little bit with my journey because it's somewhat unique. So I was an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins. I became really interested in the ethics of emerging technology from a very early standpoint. I always knew I loved science, but I always knew I loved the humanities too. So I was fortunate enough to major in neuroscience and philosophy. And it was a really good sort of interdisciplinary mix where I really felt like this is what I want to do. So I actually spent 4 years after undergrad just being a research assistant at Hopkins. A lot of people ask questions of, should I go straight into grad school? Should I wait? I don't think there's a right answer for everyone. But for me, it was a really interesting opportunity to learn on the ground how bioethics work is done. And I think, I would encourage anyone, if they have an opportunity to have a practical learning experience, that sometimes it's even more beneficial than, say, getting a master's degree or, another type of graduate degree where you maybe learn about neuroethics or bioethics. Actually doing that work, working with researchers who, are doing actual research was really beneficial for me because it helped me not only learn sort of a broad set of skills, it also helped me figure out what I actually want to do. What specific part of this world do I want to sort of spend my time in? So I decided after 4 years that I wanted to go to law school, in part because I was more interested in sort of the legal and policy related questions when it came to ethics, and I was a little bit less interested in, say, like the philosophical sort of conceptual work. Although, maybe it's a little bit circuitous, but I did end up going, doing my postdoc in the Department of Philosophy, again, just to get a little bit more of the philosophical aspects. But yeah, my training in law school sort of helped me put a different perspective on sort of these issues and really think about how lawyers can be beneficial in this space. I also got a master's in public health, focusing on health policy, because something I learned in law school was that lawyers don't actually work on policy issues as much as you would think. And that the policy world is actually somewhat different than even law school. So that's sort of why I decided to go back to school for that. But, again, that added another layer of sort of tools that I could sort of bring to my work. So a little bit back about my background just shows you that there are various options to sort of get involved in this space. And I'll flesh out a couple of them. So traditionally, either if you're talking about bioethics or neuroethics, there have been sort of the classic career paths to get involved. And usually that involved a terminal degree or a graduate degree in one of these areas, either moral philosophy, so a PhD in philosophy. You could go into medicine, either as a physician or as a nurse. You could go as a lawyer, either as a JD, or some places actually have a PhD in law. A lot of European and sort of places outside the US actually offer a PhD in law. There were some ethicists who had public health training, but mostly thinking about sort of public health issues around pandemics and vaccinations. There were some people who had a sociology or anthropology degree, and then a few that had a history of science and technology degree. So those were sort of the traditional sort of disciplines that you would choose if you wanted to have a career in ethics. And the jobs you might get mostly were as researchers and mostly in academic, in an academic setting, a university setting. So, for most people, their end goal would be to be a professor at a university, researching and teaching about these topics. There was some role in the government. For example, places like the NIH had hired bioethicists. Places like, some government organizations, did hire ethicists, but it was probably in comparison to research jobs, relatively rare. You could get a job as an IRB member. So most hospitals or universities have IRBs, right? Because any place that is conducting clinical trials has to get IRB approval. So if you were trained as an ethicist, that was also a position you could sort of, land up in. And the last one is you could be a clinical ethicist. So, there are lots of any hospital nowadays will hire several clinical ethicists. So, if there's a controversial or tricky case, doctors would call on the clinical ethicist at that hospital, and they would sort of provide a consultation. They'd come by and listen to the case and help sort of the team navigate sort of a difficult situation. Oftentimes those were things related to end of life care. A classic example of what a clinical ethicist would do is, if there is someone who is nearing the end of life and the family sort of, wants one thing, but they had maybe, wishes in an advance directive that said, another thing. That's sort of a classic example of when a clinical ethicist might come in and try to manage that sort of disagreement. So that was a classic job that you could have in ethics as well. But there are some emerging career paths in ethics, and this is changing, and this is more sort of for bioethics, but I think it'll eventually come for neuroethics. So there are now specialized degrees in bioethics. There's a degree called the Master's in Bioethics. In some places, you can actually get a PhD in bioethics, and that's perfectly a reasonable approach to go. But what I will say is that because those degrees are newer, there's still a preference in getting one of those traditional degrees. So I've had a lot of my mentors say, don't actually get a PhD in bioethics, maybe get a master's in bioethics just to see if you like it, and then, get a PhD in something else. In part because it's such a new field, and because it's interdisciplinary, there isn't really one method of doing bioethics. It's a bunch of different tools, right? Same with neuroethics. So I think the traditional wisdom and wisdom that I think continues to be out there is don't get a bioethics degree or a neuroethics degree, get a degree in something else, get a degree in neuroscience, get a degree in law, get a degree in medicine, sociology, anthropology, get one of those traditional degrees because it'll actually make you more competitive when you're looking for a job. If you want to get a master's or a specialization in bioethics or neuroethics on top of that traditional degree, then great, and that would set you apart, but it's not enough of a field yet where getting that degree directly is actually going to help you. But there are some other areas that have sort of expanded. So, I've seen people who've gotten PhDs in English or literature enter the bioethics space and be successful. Increasingly, people are getting degrees in economics, health policy, political science, and are sort of working on issues in neuroethics and bioethics, as well as there's also now science and technology studies PhDs, sort of comes out of the sociology world. But again, I've seen people, get a degree in STS studies and be really successful in the bioethics world. On the flip side, there's actually a lot of new jobs that are opening in sort of ethics. For example, a lot of nonprofit organizations are now trying to hire people who have worked on ethics. I'm a perfect example. The Dana Foundation traditionally had funded neuroscience. Now they're funding neuroscience and society and neuroethics work, right? So as a practicing ethicist, I was able to find a job there because it's now valuable to have someone who has that expertise because that's our focus. So I would say the Dana Foundation is somewhat rare. I can't think of many foundations that focus 100% of their sort of energy on a topic like ethics, but increasingly there are at least other organizations and philanthropies that have at least part of their focus on ethics, right? So the Kavli Foundation is one example who, recently has started 2 science and society centers. So, and I think this is a trend that's going to continue. I think more people are realizing the importance here. So I do think that there's going to be much more jobs in the nonprofit space, not only as sort of a funder or a program officer, but actually as researchers. I think a lot of nonprofits are going to actually hire ethics researchers in the future. That gets to my point about think tanks. I think that's going to be another big area. I think think tanks are going to hire ethicists. I think there's going to be many ethics consultancy type positions where there's an organization and you're an ethicist and maybe a company comes to you, right? Like, hey, we're developing this new neurotechnology. Can you help us think through some of the ethics questions, right? So I think that's going to happen. One example already is the Institute of Neuroethics, which was started by someone named Karen Rommelfanger, who's formerly, or I guess still is faculty at Emory. But she said she started this new organization in part to be a sort of a neuroethics think tank, right? Because I think increasingly people are realizing that trying to approach a lot of these issues in just academia can be limited, and you have a little bit more impact, for example, if you can be in a think tank or a nonprofit organization. So Karen Rommelfanger's organization, IonX, actually helps sort of people in industry who are actually developing these technologies, get a better grasp of the ethics, or get some help in terms of navigating particularly difficult issues. There's also a growing need in science communication. I think recently I've seen sort of an explosion in people who care about sort of neuroscience and society or neuroethics issues taking on positions like the Civic Science Fellowship Program. And really the Civic Science Fellowship Program started because there was this challenge of how do we educate the public or different stakeholders about scientific issues. And increasingly that's also come to incorporate how do we educate the public about ethical issues, about societal issues. So a lot of civic science fellows recently have projects that focus on ethics, as well as science writing, for example, is becoming increasingly interested in these topics. So that's also a route you could go. Lastly, I'll just mention government again. I think there are even more government jobs that are becoming sort of more aware of ethicists. For example, DARPA, which is the Defense Agency's research arm, recently, explicitly said they are interested in ethics. They're interested in hiring ethicists to work on projects. Places like the FDA, places like other sort of parts of the federal government, at least in the United States, are more and more sort of looking to ethicists for their expertise. So that is to say that traditionally there were mostly academic jobs, but now increasingly there are other options. So you don't have to sort of become a professor if you don't want to. But again, it's sort of a new field, so you still have to sort of think carefully about how you navigate those things. So I'll stop there, but I'd love to take any questions either about sort of the ethics of neurotechnology or about sort of careers in this space in general. I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, so I'd love to take any questions that you guys have.
That was an amazing walkthrough. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Everyone, if we could join together in a virtual round of applause. It's very awkward and quiet on Zoom, but
no problem.
Wonderful nonetheless. All right, everyone, if you have any questions that come to mind immediately, feel free to drop them into the chat. I've also toggled the unmute option once more, so you can raise your hand and ask live as we've been doing in the past. Oh, thanks for sharing this resource, Dr. Farah.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I mean, I recently read through that the career advice and education piece that Dr. Farah linked, and I totally agree with everything that's said there. I think I touched a little bit about sort of the option of, do you pursue a career or a degree specifically in bioethics or neuroethics? And if you go to the career advice there, I think it echoes what I shared and what I've heard from many of my mentors, is that it's more beneficial to find a home in some other department. I imagine most of this audience is undergraduate or high school audience that's looking to be or study neuroscience. I often get this question of, will I be disadvantaged if I am a neuroscience by training? And I would say absolutely not. In fact, we need more neuroscientists. We need more people trained in the science to enter this field, because traditionally it's been mostly people in the social sciences or philosophy. And I touched earlier on the fact that a lot of the work in ethics, at least in my opinion, can be overly speculative. It can be based on sort of misunderstanding of the science. And I really think, if you are someone who is trained in neuroscience, you can really help not only correct misconceptions about the science itself, but also, be in a really interesting position to do neuroethics work in a way that, traditional sort of fields have not been able to approach it. So, I think that would be my advice in general is, find a home that you feel passionate about. I think the other part of it is that graduate school, regardless if you go to law school or get a PhD or go to medical school, graduate school is hard. It's a really difficult time. There's a lot of challenges. So, you want to be doing something that you love, that you enjoy, that isn't sort of a slog, because, I think with any sort of new field like this, if you're trying to build a career, you sort of have to play this game of, you have to be successful in the channels that already exist, right? So another piece of advice that I think I'd give everyone is, whatever pathway you find, really think thoughtfully about what success in that pathway means, right? So if you're getting a PhD in neuroscience, you sort of have to play that game, right? What does it mean to be a successful academic neuroscientist? Because ultimately, that's how you're going to get hired, right? Because there aren't as many jobs that are specifically looking at neuroethics. If you're a lawyer, for example, right? What does it mean to be a successful lawyer, right? Because you sort of have to build that career for yourself and get a position and then sort of focus on these ethics issues, at least as of now, right? That is hopefully going to change, and part of the goal of the Dana Foundation is to build career pathways for people who are interested in neuroscience and society, so that, you know, the hope is in 10, 15 years, I could come back and say, no, absolutely, this is a defined pathway, go get that PhD in neuroethics, right? Because there's going to be a landing spot for you afterwards. Right now, that doesn't exist, but, you know, so that's why you sort of have to, again, play by the rules of the discipline you decide. But, you know, eventually the hope would be that there is actually a defined career path.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate your kind of emphasis on not just viewing your middle years between, you know, graduating high school to getting that career as just a stepping stone, but really actually investing time into understanding your interests. And also just want to emphasize once again for folks in the audience, that whole concept of like, don't close doors and
Yeah,
always
absolutely.
be open to coming back. Like in your own career, you were talking about how you sort of went away from philosophy side a little bit, then came back a few years later.
Yeah.
So definitely that aspect of like explore and don't close a door, or and just be open to exploring what comes your way as well.
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely. I mean, if I could just touch on that a little bit. I mean, I think there's a challenge though, right? So there's a challenge between, and especially in any sort of interdisciplinary work, there's a challenge between trying new things and opening new doors, but not trying too many new things, right? Because you still want to be an expert on one or two different things, because at the end of the day, someone's going to look at you and say, what is your expertise? Like, what are you bringing to the table that maybe someone else doesn't? So at that point, you're going to want to say, this is what I bring. This is my expertise. So, you know, but absolutely, right? You want to get as much exposure as possible, because you never know who you're going to meet. You never know what mentors you'll identify. And like you mentioned, right? When you have those experiences, you just never know what doors are going to open. I think if I hadn't taken that approach, I don't see myself landing in a position like this at the Dana Foundation, because, you know, a lot of people would say, no, I don't want to work at, you know, a foundation. Like that's, you know, that's not something that I'm interested in. But, you know, because again, it's a new field, you have to keep your mind open, and you have to take options when you can get them. Looking to a chat question is, you know, asking, my question is how to implement neuroethics in a new country. We need, and do we need any particular discipline? That's a really excellent question. I think it can often be very hard to introduce a new discipline into a country that doesn't have that infrastructure. But what I would say that there are small ways to do it, right? So at a very basic level, what you could do if you're an undergrad in a country outside the US where neuroethics is not a big deal, is start a neuroethics club, right? It can be very simple. You could start off by watching, you know, popular movies. You could, you know, talk about, you could have like a newspaper article or something that, you know, you discuss about the ethical issues there. You can start really small, right? The other thing I could say is that, you know, you might actually not, I think with ethics, it's really difficult because a lot of time there are people who work on ethical issues, but they don't call themselves ethicists. And that's just particularly true in other countries, right? Because that term has just not caught on. So another thing I would do is look at sort of those disciplines I mentioned, right? Philosophy, sociology, law, and try to identify faculty who sort of do that kind of work, and maybe they don't call it bioethics and neuroethics. Approach them and have a conversation with them, right? A way to sort of maybe build on an undergraduate group or something like that is inviting that faculty member to come help you sort of lead this initiative. And I think that can be difficult, right? Because it's almost like you're educating an expert on what they do, but you'll be surprised how many people would sort of come back and be like, you're right, I never knew about this. My work does align with this. Why don't we start calling it this? So I think those are some sort of some ways you can approach it. The Dana Foundation is definitely interested in providing more neuroethics and neuroscience and society educational materials that are sort of accessible for all ages. So we don't have it right now, but I would say in a year or two, look to us. There might be ways that we have sort of materials that you can just print and download and use as sort of the basis of starting some sort of initiative like that in your country. And the other thing I would mention is, and Dr. Farah mentioned this as well, right? Just keep your eyes open for different opportunities. I think even if you're not in the U.S., especially in this sort of post-pandemic world, I think there's a lot more receptivity towards virtual work, virtual mentorship. If you find someone who has really interesting work, seems like someone that could be a good mentor to you, my advice would be to reach out to them. I know that sounds odd to just cold email someone who may never have heard of you, but you'll be surprised. And I'm not going to say everyone's going to respond. They're not. A lot of people you just won't hear back from, but you'll be surprised how many people will get back to you. But if you give them, my advice would give them some short idea of what you're interested in, attach your resume or CV, and have a specific ask for them, right? Like, can I come talk to you for 30 minutes? Or can you come give a talk for my school or my organization, right? Just reach out to people. You'll be surprised how many people get back to you. And in fact, like I will highlight the fact that I don't think I would be where I am in my career today if there weren't people who responded to my emails and took a chance on me. In fact, the first job I ever got in bioethics, I just sent an email to someone and they said, you know what? Hey, we have an internship open. Why don't you come talk to us, right? So, I think that's another layer to it. If you find someone who might be helpful, don't feel shy reaching out to them, and don't get discouraged if they don't get back to you, because again, like, most people are very busy, but it happens. Like, don't get discouraged. Just keep reaching out to people. Eventually you'll find someone, who'll be able to help you out.
Absolutely. And just want to have a very quick little plug for some of the workshops later this week as well. So
Yeah,
Nikita, on Tuesday and Nikita on Friday, I believe, are going to be chatting a little bit about cold contacting. So you're going to have perfect practice to start on that avenue, folks. So definitely check those out as well.
Yeah, and great question from Matthew Lynn about sort of what my day-to-day is in terms of my position at the Dana Foundation. So I'll say, my position has been a little bit unique because I'm coming to the Dana Foundation at a time where we are completely shifting our focus. So the first year, my role has actually been much different than I think it will be in the future. But the first year of my role, I was really able to help our president and vice president sort of come up with what our new strategy was. And that's something that I really liked about working at a nonprofit is I got to sort of approach some of the same issues that I was interested in research, but from a slightly different lens and sort of on a slightly broader level, right? So instead of thinking about a specific research question, I was able to think, what general directions are we really interested in? What are some ways that we can accomplish that? So over the first year, I was able to help our program team build out what our focus is. And so, moving forward, what a lot of my job will be is, deciding, for example, like what types of research we want to fund or what types of training programs we want to fund. And a lot of my job involves having really interesting conversations with people in the field who do the work and figuring out like, how can we sort of address the need? So one example I can give you is recently we put out a call for Dana centers in neuroscience and society because we really felt that there was a lack of interdisciplinary training for this space. Going back to sort of what I was talking about, career paths, right? If you want to learn about neuroscience and society, there aren't many centers out there. University of Pennsylvania happens to be one of the few that exist, right? So part of the goal of, part of what I do as a program officer is going through this process of how can we start new centers that do sort of, build on some of the great work that's already been done in the University of Pennsylvania and really create sort of a pathway for people interested in this space. Another sort of project that we've been working on is how do we better sort of engage with different publics, either the general public or stakeholders like lawyers or clinicians or science communicators. So one of our big programs at Dana is focused on public engagement. So I don't actually, that's not my sort of role, but you know, the program officer, the program director who's responsible for that would help sort of develop different types of events, right? That you know, really have you know, like an organic exchange between the public and, you know, experts. So that's a little bit about sort of my day-to-day. I mean, I think as we sort of have these programs built out, a lot of it will be sort of grants administration. So for example, you might have 8 to 10 grantees who you give money to or fund their research. You know, you would maybe go do site visits, maybe once a year, learn about what they're doing, evaluate, you know, is their research going well? You know, is this a grantee that we want to continue funding? But I think one thing that's really unique about the Dana Foundation, which might not always be the case with other philanthropies, is we really take an active and co-collaborative role. So it's not just like, you know, we don't just give money out to grantees. We work with the grantees to develop an idea, or, you know, we increasingly believe that, you know, if we can help out or give ideas or, you know, provide assistance or find other organizations that can be helpful. We really take seriously this role of sort of putting people together. So not only are we just a funder who sort of, you know, pays the bills, we really see our role, and even my role as a program officer, of putting people in touch with each other. For example, right, maybe there's a project that they're really interested in, you know, the ethics of entrepreneurship, right? You know, in my role, I can maybe reach out to other organizations that work with industry, for example, and maybe help connect these two projects so that, you know, they can have mutually beneficial interactions. So that's another thing that I think we take seriously at Dana, and that's something that, you know, sort of in my day-to-day involves that, right? Having conversations with people, connecting people where I can, you know, organizing different workshops, sort of things of that nature.
That's really wonderful to hear. Would you mind diving a little bit deeper into kind of what
Sure.
you might be doing in a day in the life kind of scenario? Are you mostly focusing on calls with people, emails? Do you travel to conferences? What does like the day-to-day look like for you?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit of all of the above, right? So, you know, in my position, I definitely get an opportunity to travel to conferences. So I'll be going to SFN later this year. I'll be going to the International Neuro Ethics Society meeting. Right now, our president and vice president are at FENS, which is the Federation of European Neuroscience Societies. We have a meeting in Paris. So we definitely attend conferences. You know, that's something that we try to stay, you know, we try to stay on board with sort of upcoming research, emerging research. But a lot of my day-to-day is having conversations, you know, with people who are neuroethicists, for example. Again, like, you know, recently we were working on a project looking at sort of, you know, pre-genetic testing for certain types of, you know, mental disorders, and really talking about, you know, talking to different stakeholders to try to say, okay, is there a project that we can, you know, bring together? Of course, with any job, there's the more sort of administrative, boring tasks. So, you know, a day-to-day might be writing a lot of emails to someone, right? Or reading over a report that a grantee sends you about, you know, what their work has been over the last year. It can also be, you know, working with our comms team to say, for example, get the word out on a particular issue. So, you know, it really varies from the day-to-day. And I think, again, I don't want to say that like that's the case for all organizations or nonprofits, but at least at Dana, I think, you know, our program staff was built in a certain, very consciously to be able to do sort of different things and be efficient, because we're not a huge organization. So at times, you know, it's sort of all hands on deck, right? So, you know, if there's a big project, you know, everyone gets involved in that. You know, obviously everyone has their own responsibilities, but it's a very collaborative environment. So, and again, because it's sort of the early stages of our new sort of focus, there isn't as much of a defined sort of day-to-day, if that makes sense.
Thank you, appreciate that. We're getting close to time, but I'd love to highlight this kind of cultural ethics question that came by from Sanal in the chat. So Sanal comes from an underprivileged country where people believe in ghosts as perhaps or religious explanations for different psychological conditions. There's a lot of tension, it seems, between these kind of trying to have these scientific explanations for conditions, but at the intersection of cultural and religious things too. Do you have any thoughts on sort of cross-cultural approaches in that case?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And again, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to provide a satisfactory answer, but what I would say is that, and this is coming a lot out of my public health education, is that, regardless of what people believe and regardless of the explanations they give, you have to take it seriously. If you're ever going to change the mind of someone, you have to understand where they're coming from. And so the first part of that is not being immediately dismissive or skeptical, right? So, you think, okay, this person believes in ghosts that are creating their mental illness. One approach you want to avoid is going in and saying, that's just silly, right? Like, we know science says otherwise, right? Like, you really want to avoid that approach. What you want to do is really listen to their story, listen to why they believe that, and listen to what their needs are and how you could actually sort of communicate to them. I think that's a basic first step, right? Because I think what underlies any sort of interaction like that is trust. And even if you disagree with someone, I think it's really important that they feel heard, right? And if they don't feel heard, you're not going to be able to develop the trust, and you're never going to get to the point where you might be able to change their mind, even slightly. The other thing I would say is that, again, your goal is not, as a neuroscientist, is not necessarily to change their mind. It's to learn from them, right? It's to learn, what their needs are and figure out a way to, address that using the tools that you have, right? And your goal is not necessarily to change minds. That might be the goal of a science communicator. That might be the goal of an educator, for example. And if you take those roles, then sure. But if you're a neuroscientist, it's really just to understand what their challenges are. There is a great book, and the name is escaping me. I think it's called A Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And that really, I read that in undergrad, and it really sort of touches on a lot of these issues of how do you navigate some of these cultural differences. And that story, basically what happens is, I can't remember offhand the culture that, the topic, the person of focus is from, but they basically believe that seizures or epilepsy are sort of caused by spirits, and that when you have an epileptic seizure, you actually are like connecting with, spirits that give you insight into the future. So they're actually very resistant to treating epilepsy because they see that as a good thing, right? And it really, I love that book because it really digs into how, again, there's no right answer, right? And avoiding this mentality of like, hey, we're scientists, so we're right. Like, that may be true on some level, but there are various ways to be right about something. And I think that really, again, that would be my advice. And I think that's sort of what the message the book sends, right? You really have to listen. So that's what I would say.
Thanks for sharing. And absolutely, +1, that book is amazing.
Yeah.
Very eye-opening.
Well, over time, thank you so much, everyone, for having me. And as I mentioned, our website right now is going through sort of a transition, but definitely, look out to the Dana Foundation in the future, because we'll definitely have a lot more materials in this space. And thanks again for having me.
Thanks so much for sharing everything. This was a really, really awesome discussion.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Have a great day.